By the fall of 1975, Daniel Harper's work had shifted from broad changes to precise skills, the kind that could not be learned from manuals but only from repeated observation. Because across his 120 acres, the difference between collapse and recovery was now measured in details most farmers never considered, and Daniel began refining how he read his land the way a mechanic listens to an engine, subtle, patient, and exact. Starting with leaf inspection, where instead of scanning entire rows for damage, he examined individual plants, counting aphids per stem, noting whether they clustered near new growth or older leaves, recording the ratio between pests and predators, because he had discovered that the number itself mattered less than the balance between them. And he began using a simple rule in his notebook: if predator insects reached 1 for every 10 pests, intervention was unnecessary, a threshold he tested repeatedly across different sections of his fields. Adjusting for weather shifts, rainfall patterns, and soil moisture, and this level of tracking required discipline, long hours under the sun, kneeling in dirt that stained his clothes permanently. But it also revealed something powerful, that outbreaks were not random but followed patterns tied closely to temperature swings and plant stress. And once he saw that, he adjusted his irrigation timing, using less water but applying it at moments that reduced plant vulnerability instead of maximizing growth speed, because faster growth, realized, often meant weaker tissue that attracted more pests. And alongside that, he experimented with timing his planting cycles differently from his neighbors, delaying certain rows by 2 weeks so that not all crops matured at the same stage, breaking the synchronized feeding opportunity that pests relied on, and this alone began to reduce the intensity of infestations in ways that chemicals never had. And still the work did not stop there, because Daniel also studied the behavior of birds, identifying which species visited his fields most frequently, where they perched, how often they returned, and he began installing simple wooden posts along strategic points across his land, creating resting spots that increased their hunting efficiency without altering the natural flow of the system. And gradually the presence of birds became not just a sign of life but a measurable force in pest control, reducing entire clusters of insects within days. And all of these changes required a mindset that most farmers around him rejected, because none of it produced immediate visible results that could be easily replicated. There was no single action to copy, no chemical to apply, only a series of small, connected decisions that depended entirely on attention and patience. And while his neighbors continued to measure success in clean, untouched fields, Daniel began measuring it in activity, in movement, in the constant interaction between species that kept any one population from dominating. And by the end of that season, although his yields were still lower than the county average, his costs had dropped sharply. No pesticide expenses, reduced fuel usage, less machinery wear, and for the first time in years, his numbers did not point toward survival, but toward possibility. And yet that possibility came with a new kind of pressure, because if he continued down this path, the next year would not just test his system. It would expose whether all of these detailed adjustments were enough to withstand a full cycle of unpredictable weather and shifting pest populations. And as Daniel stood inside his barn one evening, flipping through pages filled with numbers that now told a story only he could read, one realization settled in quietly but firmly. This was no longer about proving a theory. It was about mastering a process that demanded more from him than any machine ever had. And the question that followed was sharper than before. Could he maintain this level of precision when the stakes inevitably grew higher? By the spring of 1976, nearly 2 years since Daniel Harper had first drained his sprayer and stepped away from chemical control, the changes across his 120 acres were no longer subtle. But they were also not yet secure, because what he had built was not a fixed system, but a living one, constantly shifting with the seasons. And as the new planting cycle began under a sky that carried heavier rains than the previous years, Daniel understood that time itself had become a variable he could no longer ignore, because every decision he made now would not show its full impact until months later, sometimes even years. and this forced him into a way of thinking that most farmers avoided, planning beyond immediate harvests and into cycles that stretched across seasons. And so instead of maximizing his soybean acreage as he once had, he reduced it to 90 acres, dedicating the remaining 30 acres to rotation crops that would never bring quick profit but would strengthen the system over time. Corn planted on 15 acres not for yield but for structure, its taller stalks altering wind flow and creating microclimates that slowed the spread of certain pests, and another 15 acres reserved for mixed cover crops, a combination of rye, clover, and vetch, designed to protect the soil through heavy rains while feeding the organisms beneath the surface that no one ever saw but that determined the health of everything above it. And these decisions confused even those who had stopped mocking him, because from the outside it looked like Daniel was intentionally reducing his income potential, sacrificing acres that could have produced immediate returns. And in truth he was, because he had come to understand that stability was built slowly, often at the cost of short-term gains. And as the weeks passed and temperatures fluctuated unpredictably, his fields responded in ways that confirmed both his progress and his vulnerability. Early pest outbreaks appeared again, though less aggressive than before, spreading across younger plants that had not yet developed resilience. And for a brief moment, Daniel felt the old instinct return, the urge to intervene, to stop the spread before it became visible. But he resisted, not blindly, but by returning to his data, comparing this year's patterns to the previous ones, noting that predator insects were arriving earlier than before, that bird activity had increased significantly since he had expanded their perching zones, and that soil moisture levels were holding more consistently despite irregular rainfall. And these indicators gave him something more valuable than certainty. They gave him patience, and so he allowed the process to unfold again, watching as the early imbalance corrected itself faster than it had the year before, weeks instead of months. And for the first time, Daniel saw clear evidence that time itself was compounding his decisions, that what he had started in 1974 was beginning to reinforce itself in 1976. And yet this progression also revealed a new challenge, because as his system grew stronger, it also became more complex, harder to predict, dependent on interactions he could not fully control. And this meant that every season would bring new variables, new risks, new adjustments, and there would never be a point where the system simply ran on its own without attention. And this realization forced Daniel to accept something that many farmers never did, that sustainability was not a destination, but a continuous process, one that demanded constant awareness rather than occasional intervention. And as the early summer sun broke through clouds that had lingered for weeks, casting light across fields that now held a visible mix of crops, insects, and birds in constant motion, Daniel Harper stood quietly at the edge of his land and recognized that the timeline he had entered could not be rushed, could not be forced, and would not reward impatience. And the question that followed him into the next phase of his work was no longer about whether the system could function, but whether he could endure the time it required to reach its full strength. By the late summer of 1976, Daniel Harper reached a point few farmers ever experience, where the system he had built no longer looked fragile but began to reveal a quiet strength that could only be seen over time. And across his 120 acres, the signs were no longer hidden in notebooks or subtle observations. They were visible in the way the land moved, in the rhythm that had replaced the chaos of the previous years. Because where insects had once surged uncontrollably, they now appeared in waves that rose and fell without overwhelming the crops, and where silence had once dominated his fields after years of chemical use, there was now constant activity, birds moving in patterns that seemed almost intentional, landing, feeding, lifting again in cycles that repeated across different sections of the farm. And Daniel began to notice something he had not expected, that the system was not just stabilizing, it was accelerating its own balance. because each predator population that established itself reduced the time needed to correct future outbreaks, shortening cycles that had once taken weeks into days, and this compounding effect changed the way he measured time entirely, no longer season by season but interaction by interaction. And yet, even as this progress unfolded, the financial pressure that had followed him since 1974 had not disappeared, because although his costs had dropped significantly, his yields still lagged slightly behind the highest producing farms in the county, and the market did not yet recognize what he was building. Grain buyers paid by volume, not by method, and so for a while Daniel existed in a narrow space between innovation and survival, earning enough to continue but not enough to feel secure. And it was during this period that another shift began, one that had nothing to do with insects or crops, but with perception, because a few farmers who had once mocked him began to visit quietly, not in groups, not openly, but one at a time, walking his fields, asking careful questions, observing the differences they could no longer ignore. And Daniel answered them without persuasion, showing them his notes, his numbers, his patterns, not as proof but as a record of what he had seen. And some left unconvinced, still tied to methods that guaranteed immediate results. But others began to reconsider, especially those who had started noticing the same rising costs and diminishing returns in their own operations, and still Daniel did not attempt to convert anyone, because he understood that this approach could not be copied without the same patience that had shaped it. And as the harvest season approached, something unexpected happened. His yields, while not the highest, were more consistent across all 120 acres than any previous year. Fewer extreme losses, fewer damaged sections, a stability that reduced overall risk, even if it did not maximize output. And when he calculated his final numbers, factoring in the complete absence of pesticide costs, reduced fuel usage, and lower equipment wear, the result was something no one had predicted. His net profit matched, and in some cases exceeded, that of farms producing more volume, and this was the first moment where the system translated into something the market could recognize, even if it did not fully understand it. And still Daniel knew this was not the end of the process, because the following year would test something far more difficult than building or stabilizing. It would test whether the system could withstand a true crisis, an unpredictable event that could either confirm everything he had built or expose its limits entirely. And as he stored his harvest inside a barn that once held chemical barrels but now stood nearly empty, one thought remained steady in his mind, that strength was not proven in calm seasons, but in moments when everything was pushed beyond its normal limits. And the question that lingered as the year came to a close was simple but unavoidable. What would happen when that moment finally arrived? In the spring of 1977, the test Daniel Harper had quietly anticipated finally arrived, not as a gradual shift, but as a sudden, overwhelming surge that spread across eastern Kansas, with a speed no farmer could ignore. Because that year brought an unusually warm winter followed by early humidity, conditions that allowed insect populations to survive and multiply before the planting season had even fully begun. And within weeks, reports traveled across the county of fields being overrun, entire sections of crops stripped down faster than machines could respond. And for the first time since Daniel had abandoned chemical control, the pressure around him was not just social, it was real, measurable, and immediate, because what he had built over the past 3 years was now facing a level of stress far beyond anything he had previously observed. And as he walked his 120 acres in those early weeks, he saw it clearly. Pest density rising faster than predator populations could initially match, clusters forming in areas that had remained stable the year before, leaves showing damage patterns he had not recorded before, and for a moment, brief but sharp moment, doubt returned with full force, because this was exactly the scenario his neighbors had warned him about, the kind of outbreak that could wipe out an entire season if not stopped quickly. And unlike previous years, this time the margin for patience was dangerously thin, because waiting too long could mean irreversible loss, And still Daniel did not reach for chemicals, not immediately, but instead he intensified his observation, doubling the time he spent in the fields, tracking not just where pests were, but how fast they were moving, identifying which sections were most vulnerable and which still held balance, and he began making targeted adjustments within the system he had built, reinforcing edges where predator activity was highest, adding temporary water sources to attract more birds during the peak feeding hours, and even manually redistributing small clusters of beneficial insects from stable zones into threatened areas, a slow physical process that required hours of work each day under a sun that seemed to amplify the urgency of every decision. And despite all of this, the crisis deepened before it improved. Weeks where the fields looked worse than they had at any point since 1974, neighbors driving past again, some not mocking this time, but watching with a quiet sense of validation, if expecting to see the inevitable collapse they had predicted from the beginning. And Daniel felt that weight, the knowledge that failure now would not just cost him a harvest, but would erase years of effort and reinforce the very belief he had set out to challenge. And yet what kept him from abandoning the system was not confidence but consistency, because even within the worst sections he still saw the same patterns beginning to form. Predators increasing where pests surged, birds returning in higher numbers than any previous year, cycles beginning to shorten again, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, the shift began, not all at once, not dramatically, but in patches, small areas where damage stopped spreading, then areas where new growth appeared stronger, and over the course of several weeks the balance returned. Not perfectly, not without loss, but enough to prevent the collapse everyone had expected. And by midsummer of 1977, what had started as the most severe crisis his system had faced became the moment that defined it, because it proved something no normal season could have shown: that the system did not depend on calm conditions to function. It adapted under pressure, and when the harvest season finally arrived, his yields were reduced compared to the previous year, but not destroyed, and more importantly, his costs had remained stable while others had surged, because many farmers had doubled their chemical applications to fight the outbreak, increasing expenses in ways that would affect them long after the season ended. And as Daniel stood in his fields after the worst had passed, looking across land that had endured something few believed it could survive, one realization settled in with a clarity he had not felt before. That resilience was not built by avoiding crisis, but by enduring it. And the question that remained was no longer about whether his method could survive, but about what would happen when the world outside his farm finally began to notice. By the autumn of 1977, what had once looked like defiance began to resemble proof, not because Daniel Harper's fields were perfect, but because they were consistent in a way that numbers could no longer ignore. And across his 120 acres, the system that had nearly broken under pressure months earlier now revealed its most unexpected quality: recovery speed. Because while other farms still struggled with lingering pest pockets and rising input costs, Daniel's land corrected itself faster with each passing week. And this reversal did not happen in silence, because word began to travel beyond Coffee County, first through grain buyers who noticed his stable deliveries, then through a small agricultural newsletter that mentioned his unusual methods without fully understanding them, and soon enough a representative from a regional cooperative visited his farm, not to mock, not to advise, but to observe, walking the fields slowly, asking precise questions about acres, yields, input costs, pest ratios, and most importantly, how he had managed to reduce chemical dependency without collapsing production. And Daniel answered in the same way he always had, with records instead of claims, showing notebooks filled with dates, temperatures, rainfall levels, insect counts per plant, predator ratios, machinery hours reduced from 420 per season down to just under 260, and cost sheets that revealed something the visitor could not ignore: that while his gross output per acre was slightly lower, his net margin per acre had surpassed most conventional farms in the region. And this was the moment the system crossed from theory into value, because markets did not reward ideals, they rewarded numbers. And suddenly the same neighbors who had once dismissed him found themselves asking different questions, not whether he was wrong, but whether what he was doing could be replicated. And Daniel understood the danger in that shift, because replication without understanding would fail. And so he did not offer shortcuts. He explained the time, the failed observations, the 2 years of uncertainty, the need to track patterns across seasons, and many lost interest when they realized there was no immediate formula, but a few remained, and among them was Carl Benson, the same farmer who had once called Daniel's approach surrender, who now stood quietly at the edge of the field, watching birds move across the rows in coordinated patterns, and admitted that something here worked even if he could not yet explain it. And as the harvest numbers finalized, the reversal became undeniable. Daniel's soybeans, grown without chemical pesticides, were accepted into a small but growing organic market channel, priced nearly 5 times higher per unit than conventional crops, not because of yield, but because of method. And this single shift changed the entire equation, because for the first time, the system he had built did not just match conventional farming, it exceeded it in profitability, and the symbol that had once defined his risk, the rusted sprayer sitting unused in his barn, now represented something entirely different, not abandonment, but transition, a tool that marked the moment he had chosen uncertainty over control. And as winter approached again, 3 full years since he had first stopped spraying, Daniel Harper stood in a place no one in his county had expected him to reach, not because he had avoided failure, but because he had moved through it long enough to arrive somewhere others had never allowed themselves to go. And the question that remained was no longer whether his method could work, but whether the industry around him was ready to accept what it meant. In the harvest of 1978, the outcome that had been building quietly for 4 seasons finally became visible in a way no ledger could hide, because across Daniel Harper's 120 acres, the numbers aligned with the patterns he had been tracking since the day he drained his sprayer. And this time, the result was not marginal improvement or cautious stability, it was a clear, undeniable payoff, as his soybean fields, supported by the rotation system he had layered over time, produced yields that, while still slightly below the county's highest peaks, were remarkably uniform from edge to edge, minimizing loss and eliminating the extreme drops that had once defined his early seasons. And when those yields entered the organic channel that had opened to him the previous year, the pricing transformed the entire outcome, early 5 times the conventional rate, turning what would have been an average harvest into a financial result that surpassed even the most optimized chemical-based operations nearby. And yet the true payoff extended beyond price, because his cost structure had stabilized at a level few others could reach. No pesticide purchases, reduced fuel consumption from 420 hours of machinery use down to under 240, lower maintenance expenses, and a soil profile that required fewer inputs each season as organic matter increased and water retention improved. And when Daniel ran the full calculation that winter, accounting for every acre, every hour, every dollar, the conclusion was not just that his system worked, but that it had fundamentally changed the economics of his farm, shifting it from a cycle of dependency into one of self-reinforcing efficiency. And this shift began to ripple outward in ways he had not anticipated, because buyers who had once treated his crops as standard commodities now saw them as differentiated products. Local distributors began requesting consistent supply under organic certification, and even agricultural advisors who had dismissed his approach started referencing his results in cautious discussions about alternative methods. And still Daniel did not frame this as a victory over others, because he understood that what he had achieved could not be separated from the years it had taken, the risk he had absorbed, and the patience required to let a system rebuild itself. And as he walked through his fields after the final harvest, the land carried a different presence, not quieter, not controlled, but balanced in a way that no longer depended on his constant intervention. And the symbol that had followed him since 1974, the rusted sprayer, remained untouched in the corner of his barn, not as a reminder of what he had rejected, but as a marker of the exact point where everything had changed. And as the season closed and numbers settled into records that others would eventually study, Daniel Harper faced a realization that went beyond profit or validation, that the payoff of what he had built was not a single harvest, but a system that would continue to strengthen long after the initial decision had been made, and the question that remained was no longer about results, but about what responsibility came with proving something that could reshape the way others farmed if they were willing to follow the same path. By the winter of 1979, Daniel Harper's farm was no longer just a piece of land in eastern Kansas. It had become a reference point, a quiet example of what could happen when a farmer stopped fighting every problem directly, and instead learned to build systems that solved themselves over time. And yet Daniel himself never described it that way, because standing in the same barn where his rusted sprayer still sat untouched in the corner, he understood that nothing about the past 5 years had been simple or guaranteed, and what others now called success had once looked exactly like failure, and this perspective shaped the way he carried the legacy of what he had built, not as a method to be copied blindly, but as a philosophy that required discipline, observation, and above all patience. And as more farmers began visiting his 120 acres, walking the same rows that had once been overrun, asking how to replicate the results, Daniel did not offer them shortcuts or fixed formulas. He gave them something far less comfortable. He told them to start by changing how they measured success, to stop looking only at immediate yields and begin tracking interactions, patterns, and long-term costs, to see a farm not as a factory, but as a system where every action had consequences that extended beyond a single season. And for some, this was enough to begin their own transition, slowly, cautiously, while others returned to their established methods, unwilling to risk the uncertainty that Daniel had endured. And he accepted both outcomes without judgment, because he knew that no system could replace the willingness to observe and adapt. And as the years continued, his farm required less intervention, not because it had reached perfection, but because the balance he had allowed to develop continued reinforcing itself. Predator populations stabilizing earlier each season, soil retaining more moisture through unpredictable weather, crops showing resilience even under stress, and the financial model holding steady as organic demand grew. But what mattered most to Daniel was not the external validation or the increased profit. It was the shift in control, because where he had once believed that control meant constant action, now understood that true control often came from restraint, from knowing when not to interfere, and the symbol of that understanding remained in plain sight, the old sprayer that had once defined his approach to farming, now covered in dust, no longer a tool but a reminder of a different way of thinking. And as he stood at the edge of his fields one evening, watching birds move across land that had once been silent, he recognized that the legacy of what he had built was not the elimination of problems, but the creation of a system that could respond to them without collapsing. And that idea extended far beyond farming into any system where balance could replace force if given enough time. And as the sun dropped below the horizon, casting long shadows across 120 acres that had transformed over 5 years, the final question that had followed him since the beginning no longer needed an answer, because the result was already there, visible in every interaction across his land, proving quietly that sometimes the most powerful decision a person can make is not to act immediately, but to step back long enough to let something stronger take its place.